But a big part of a crankbait rod is that soft tip. Hey fans, KastKing Pro, Brent Chapman here. We're going to dive into our technique specific rod talk here, and this one's pretty in depth. This is, we're going to talk about our casting series of crankbait rods, and you know, crankbaits as a whole, they are a huge part of fishing. I mean, if you go to a tackle store and you look, there is a vast array of crankbaits, and you know, it's probably one of my most favorite techniques out there is catch them on a crankbait, and it's one of those things that I've spent a career learning and perfecting and honing my skills on crankbaits. And I thought what I would do is go through this and just share with you the differences in the rods. We've got, like I said, 4 in the casting series lineup of 4 different rods. We've got the 6/8 square bill, the Speed Demon Pro 6/8 square bill. Then we step up to the 7-foot crankbait, a 7-foot lipless crankbait, and last but not least, the deep crankbait, which is a 7-foot 10. And you know, each type of crankbait requires a little bit different rod to fish it most effectively. So what we've got here is, for starters, we have the Speed Demon Pro square bill crankbait rod. If you look at the specs on this one, it's a moderate action, medium power, 10 to 20 pound line, half to 1 ounce of baits. And this rod kind of describes it. Square bill crankbaits. Square bill crankbaits are a huge part of crankbait fishing. They've gotten very popular. They're very easy to fish. Got a little square bill here myself. When it comes to fishing square bill crankbaits, I prefer, this is the Bassinator Elite 8-to-1 gear ratio reel. I like a faster gear ratio for square bills, anywhere from 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon line. This rod, being only 6/8, made for close quarters. You're in there making short little casts, maybe around laydowns or docks or something like that. But a big part of a crankbait rod is that soft tip. And I believe the 2 biggest reasons you want that soft tip is when you're working that crankbait along, and when a bass comes up, believe it or not, you can actually, with I think how sensitive rods are and the line are, you can actually feel a fish as he's biting the bait. And I think people tend to pull that rod or pull the bait away from the fish, and then subsequently they get a bad hookup. Or what also happens when you do hook that fish is on a soft tip rod, when that fish is pulling, you know, treble hooks sometimes don't hook the fish as good as let's say a flipping hook or something. So if there's nothing that gives, you got a really stiff rod and that fish is maybe barely skin hooked and he shakes, it's going to come off. Where if you have that soft tip, that tip allows that fish to kind of pull on there and not come off as well. You know, I think that's a huge part. Plus, when you're making long casts, you load that rod up, that tip will load up and throw that bait much, much farther as well. So the 6/8 square bill is really good for, obviously, your 1.5s and 2.5s of square bill crankbaits, but you know, there's a lot of little finesse crankbaits out there on the market as well that rod's really good for also. Now we'll step up to the 7-foot crankbait. This one's a little bit more for, you can still use it for those square bills, but all your kind of medium diving crankbaits is what I would describe it as. This is the Speed Demon Pro, the 7-foot crankbait. You know, the specs on this one are a moderate action, medium power, 8 to 17 pound line, 1/4 to 3/4 ounce baits. I really like this one, like I said, for medium crankbaits. We've got a little medium diving bait right here. Great little bait. This setup, same deal, same tip action, all that. I can throw this thing a mile. Difference on this one is I have this on the Royal Legend Elite. This one is a big difference here. It's a 5-3-to-1. And if you're new to crankbait fishing, I really recommend to people, especially when you get into medium and deep diving crankbaits, to go with a slower gear ratio reel. And what that does for you is you can feel the bait a lot more. It gives you, the higher you go in gear ratio, the less feel you have of that bait.
Oh, look, I got two. Boom! That's going to be a fish landing violation. 2-minute penalty.
With the slower gear ratio, that was a big key for me learning how to crankbait fish. So for medium and deep diving crankbaits, I prefer the slower gear ratio reel.
I had two. How about that? Two at once.
Plus, it helps you keep that steady retrieve as well, and it doesn't wear you out as much as a faster gear ratio reel. So this is the Royal Legend Elite 5.3-to-1. Obviously, all the whole lineup is we've got the wind grips, got the right rod length handle here, got the bait keeper here. But this is a good setup for your medium diving crankbaits, is the 7-foot crankbait, one of my favorites. Next in the lineup is your lipless cranking rod, which that kind of describes it, your lipless crankbaits. This one, the specs on it, this one's a little bit heavier. This is a moderate action, medium power, 8 to 17 pound line, 3/8 to 1.5 ounce crankbaits as well. But this one's primarily for your lipless crankbaits. Lipless crankbaits a lot you're fishing in vegetation, so this one has more backbone to it. So, you know, maybe into your bigger square bills, your 2.5s, but your lipless crankbaits, this one's great for it. But a big key on lipless crankbaits, that's where you want to go with your high-speed reels. This is the 1-to-1 Bassinator Elite. Another good choice for lipless crankbaits is the Speed Demon Pro. This is a 9-to-1 gear ratio reel, super fast, and that's how you fish lipless crankbaits. A lot of times you're burning them really fast, or you're jigging them, and with that high-speed reel you can do a lot of the jigging with the reel itself. So the faster it is, the more you can do that. But when it comes to lipless crankbaits, for me, like I said, a high-speed reel, and I'm going to use 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon line or 30 to 50 pound braid when it comes to lipless crankbaits. It kind of depends if you're fishing them in vegetation. Braided line really helps you rip that bait out of there. But the 7-foot lipless cranking, it's an awesome setup as well. Everybody's got to love fishing lipless crankbaits. Last but not least, the big boy. And those of you that have fished crankbaits before know what I'm talking about. Those that you haven't, you got to experience deep diving crankbaits. And you know, here I've got one here. This is a deep diving one. That big monster bill on there. You know, if you have it on the wrong setup, it'll wear you out. And that's what I think people get discouraged on. But the big key there is to put it on the right setup. And you know, this is probably on the small spectrum of your big Magnum crankbaits, but they have big ones now. You know, a couple ounces, great big bills on them. And if you have it on too light of a setup, they'll wear you out. I mean, the rod can't handle those baits. This rod is that. This one can handle it. This is the deep crankbait. It's a 7'10". The specs on this sucker, it's a moderate action again, medium power, which is a big key for crankbaits. But this is 10 to 30 pounds, so it tells you how much heavier, and 1/2 ounce to 2 ounce crankbaits as well. So this thing can handle it. And the big key again, when you've got that big heavy crankbait on there, you've got that soft tip. When I fire that thing out there, I can really load that rod up and I can throw that thing a mile. This one is kind of unique. I've got it on the new KastKing 300. This is a 5-to-1 gear ratio reel, 5-4-to-1 gear ratio reel. This thing can hold a lot of line, but if you're throwing those big Magnum crankbaits out there a mile, having a big reel is kind of an important part of that, because you can really launch it with this big rod, big reel, that slower gear ratio. You can take a big Magnum crankbait and crank it all day long and keep it down there in the strike zone where those big fish live. So there you have it in a nutshell. This is the Speed Demon Pro lineup of KastKing crankbait rods. We've got the square bill cranking, the 7-foot crankbait, the 7-foot lipless cranking, and then to top it off, the 710 deep crankbait. So if you're getting into crankbaits, you definitely want to check these out. Hey KastKing fans, let's go fishing.